The tech billionaire parked his $500,000 Maybach in front of a crumbling Brooklyn row house, armed with a $50,000 hush money check and a 23-year-old mistress draped in diamonds. He planned to force his ex-wife to sign away her rights, expecting to find her living in squalor and regret. When the mistress shoved the check into the ex-wife's hand, laughing at her plain clothes, they had absolutely no idea they had just walked into a meticulously disguised $10 million fortress. And they certainly didn't know that the quietly elegant white woman standing before them was not a brocoder, but the sole heir to a $50 billion old money dynasty who had just spent the last 5 years quietly setting a trap that would vaporize their entire world in exactly 30 minutes. Chapter 1: The Slumming Billionaire. When 46-year-old tech CEO Julian Sterling parked his sleek, obsidian black 2025 Mercedes Maybach outside a dilapidated brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, he had one pathetic, deeply narcissistic goal. He wanted to humiliate his ex-wife, Eleanor, in front of his new fiancée. Julian stepped out of the climate-controlled, soundproof cabin of the Maybach. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit. He was a man who looked exactly like what a Silicon Valley success story was supposed to look like. A sharp jawline, silver hair perfectly styled, teeth bleached to a blinding white, and an aura of relentless, predatory confidence. He was the founder of Sterling Data Solutions, a cloud infrastructure company that was allegedly finalizing a massive acquisition by a global conglomerate the following week. The merger would push his personal net worth past the $2 billion mark. Sitting in the passenger seat of the Maybach, refusing to open her own door, was Chloe. Chloe was 23. She was an aspiring fashion influencer whose primary talent was spending Julian's money. She wore a pristine white Chanel tweed jacket, her slender wrists weighed down by a stack of gold Cartier love bracelets that jingled aggressively every time she swiped her phone screen. The driver, a stoic man named Thomas, hurried around the car and opened Chloe's door. Chloe stepped out, her red-soled Louboutins wobbling precariously on the cracked, uneven Brooklyn pavement. She immediately pinched her nose, her face twisting in an exaggerated mask of disgust. "Babe, are you sure we have the right address?" Chloe whined, her voice pitched high and nasal. "It smells like garbage and cheap fried food out here. I feel like someone is going to steal the hubcaps off the car while we're standing here." Julian wrapped his arm around her waist, offering a cruel, nostalgic smile as he looked at the crumbling facade of the building in front of them. "This is exactly where I left her, Chloe," Julian said. 10 years ago, Julian and Eleanor had been a team. They had met in a cramped, freezing graduate school library in Boston. He was a cutthroat business major with big ideas and no capital. She was a brilliant, incredibly quiet software engineer with a mind that worked in flawless algorithms. Eleanor was a striking, pale woman with sharp aristocratic features and a quiet, unshakable dignity. She preferred oversized cashmere sweaters to designer gowns. She would rather debug a complex server architecture for 48 hours straight than attend a networking gala. She had spent countless nights writing the foundational code for what would eventually become the backbone of Julian's company. But as the company began to attract its first $1 million in venture capital, Julian's perspective shifted. He became addicted to high society. He started rubbing shoulders with generational wealth, entirely desperate to fit in. He decided that Eleanor, who refused to flaunt wealth or play the role of the glamorous trophy wife, was no longer a fit for the elite life he was building. When the divorce came 5 years ago, Julian had hired a team of ruthless, aggressive corporate lawyers. He had buried Eleanor in a mountain of paperwork, ultimately forcing her to sign a separation agreement that left her with a paltry sum and the deed to this exact dilapidated Brooklyn brownstone, which they had bought as a fixer-upper right before the split. He had expected her to fight. He had expected her to beg. Instead, Eleanor had simply signed the papers, packed a single suitcase, and walked away into absolute obscurity. "It is just so depressing," Chloe sighed, checking her reflection in the tinted window of the Maybach. "Why didn't you just have your fancy lawyers mail her the document? Why do we have to physically be in this awful neighborhood?" "Because, my love," Julian said, turning to stroke Chloe's cheek, "lawyers cannot guarantee she won't hire some cheap, ambulance-chasing attorney to delay the process." Julian pulled a sleek black leather folder from the back seat of the car. Sterling Data is in the final stages of a massive merger with Apex Global, Julian explained, his voice tightening slightly. The due diligence team found a tiny, insignificant loophole in the original IP transfer from 5 years ago. It is a ghost in the machine, a technicality. But Apex wants it completely closed before they wire the $2 billion on Monday. He looked up at the peeling paint on the front door of the brownstone. I need Eleanor to sign a simple quitclaim deed releasing any retroactive rights to the legacy code, Julian said. And honestly, Chloe, I want to see her face. I want her to see me, to see you, and to understand exactly what she lost when she refused to keep up with my ambition. Julian walked with the swagger of a conqueror, leading the way up the crumbling concrete stairs of the stoop. He noticed a slight crack in one of the steps and scoffed out loud. 5 years, and she couldn't even afford to fix the stairs. It validated every choice he had ever made. He raised his fist and knocked firmly on the heavy, weathered wooden door. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of distant traffic. Chloe sighed heavily, crossing her arms so her cardiac bracelets clinked together. Maybe she is at work, Chloe sneered, probably taking an extra shift at whatever sad little diner she works at to pay the heating bill. The heavy deadbolt clicked. The old wooden door groaned open. Eleanor stood in the threshold. Julian felt a sudden, involuntary tightening in his chest. He had expected to see a broken woman. He had expected exhaustion, premature aging, perhaps the faded bitterness of a scorned ex-wife living in poverty. Instead, Eleanor looked positively radiant. She was 38, but her skin was flawless. She wasn't wearing rags. She was dressed in a pair of loose-flowing cream-colored linen trousers and a soft, incredibly thick cashmere turtleneck. Chloe immediately looked at Eleanor's clothes, searching for logos. Finding none, Chloe smirked, assuming the outfit was cheap. What Chloe, with her new money sensibilities, failed to recognize was that the unmarked cashmere sweater was Loro Piana, and it cost more than her entire Chanel outfit combined. It was the quiet, invisible uniform of true, generational wealth. Eleanor looked at Julian. Her piercing gray eyes were completely devoid of the shock, awe, or intimidation he had desperately craved. Her gaze then slowly slid to Chloe, taking in the loud logos, the excessive jewelry, and the aggressive posture. Julian, Eleanor said. Her voice was smooth, a rich, cultured alto that commanded the space without needing to raise its volume. To what do I owe the intrusion? Hello, Eleanor, Julian said, quickly recovering his composure and puffing out his chest. It has been a long time. You are looking exactly the same. I wish I could say the same for you. Julian, Eleanor replied calmly. Her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on his visibly whitened teeth and the slight stiffness of his tailored jacket. You look like you're trying very, very hard. Chloe bristled instantly, stepping forward to link her arm possessively through Julian's. I am Chloe, she chirped, her voice intentionally pitched higher to sound youthful. Julian's fiancé. He has told me so much about you. Well, not much really, Chloe added with a vicious little laugh. Just that you used to be married before he became successful. Eleanor offered Chloe a slow, almost pitying smile. A pleasure, Chloe, Eleanor said softly. It is always fascinating to meet Julian's reflections. Reflections? Chloe frowned, genuinely confused by the vocabulary. Never mind her, sweetheart, Julian interrupted smoothly, sensing Chloe was out of her depth. He held up the black leather folder. Eleanor, I don't want to take up your day, Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. I know you probably have errands to run, or whatever it is you do now, but I need to speak with you regarding a minor legal formality. It requires your signature. Eleanor did not reach for the folder. She kept her hands resting comfortably in the pockets of her linen trousers. A legal formality that requires the billionaire CEO of Sterling Data to hand-deliver it to Bedford Stuyvesant? Eleanor mused, tilting her head. Your lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell must be terribly underpaid if they are outsourcing courier work to you, Julian. Julian's jaw tightened. He hated that she wasn't bowing to the spectacle of the Maybach idling behind them. It is a sensitive document, Eleanor, Julian said stiffly. I prefer to handle it personally. Can we step inside? Or is the living room currently a construction zone? He looked pointedly at the peeling paint on the doorframe. Eleanor paused. A strange, fleeting spark danced in her gray eyes. It was a look of deep, private amusement. "Of course," Eleanor said, stepping back and pulling the heavy wooden door wide open. "Please, come into my home." Chapter 2: The Stealth Wealth Fortress. Julian stepped over the threshold, pulling Chloe behind him. He was fully preparing himself for the smell of mildew, the sight of cheap thrift store furniture, and the depressing reality of lower-class living. The entry hallway was intentionally dark, illuminated only by a single, Edison-style bulb. The walls here were indeed stripped, showing raw lath and plaster. "Watch your step, babe," Julian whispered loudly to Chloe. "Don't touch the walls. You'll get dirt on your jacket." Eleanor led them down the narrow, dimly lit corridor toward the back of the house. "Mind the dust in the entryway," Eleanor said over her shoulder, her voice perfectly even. "The Historical Preservation Society has very strict rules about how I restore the original 1890s facade." They turned the corner into the main living space. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. The air violently left his lungs. Chloe's jaw literally dropped, a small, ungraceful gasp escaping her glossed lips. The back of the crumbling brownstone had been completely hollowed out and transformed into a staggering, multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece. The ceiling soared 20 feet high, crowned by a massive, structural glass skylight that flooded the room with natural, diffused autumn light. The walls were original exposed brick, but they had been painstakingly restored, sealed, and structurally reinforced, serving as the dramatic backdrop for massive, vibrant pieces of original contemporary art. Julian's eyes darted to the painting hanging above the fireplace. It was an original Rothko. He knew it wasn't original because he had tried to bid on it at a Christie's auction in Geneva 2 years ago, only to be effortlessly outbid by an anonymous telephone buyer. The floor was wide plank, reclaimed French oak. In the center of the room sat a sprawling, custom-built curved sofa, upholstered in deep, emerald green Loro Piana cashmere, facing a sleek, modern fireplace suspended entirely from the ceiling. Beyond the living area was a kitchen that violently rivaled anything Julian had in his sterile Manhattan penthouse. It featured dramatic, seamless slabs of imported black Calicut marble, matte black custom cabinetry, and a gleaming, professional-grade La Marzocco espresso machine. Through a massive wall of floor-to-ceiling retractable glass doors at the back, Julian could see a lush, meticulously landscaped private courtyard featuring a massive Japanese koi pond and a modern, smokeless fire pit. This was not a dilapidated fixer-upper. This was a stealth wealth fortress. It was a property that, in this rapidly gentrifying market, easily commanded $10 to $15 million in cash. "Please, have a seat at the table," Eleanor said effortlessly, gesturing to a stunning, live-edge walnut dining table surrounded by original Hans Wegner wishbone chairs. Julian was experiencing profound, paralyzing cognitive dissonance. He walked toward the table, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for a crack in the facade, a sign of cheapness, a tell, a fake. But there was none. The acoustics of the room were perfectly dampened. The air smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood and fresh eucalyptus, entirely devoid of the street smell outside. "Eleanor," Julian started, his voice completely losing its polished, arrogant edge. "What? How did you pay for all of this? This renovation, this is millions of dollars." "I work, Julian," Eleanor said simply, not elaborating further. She walked into the breathtaking kitchen and began preparing hot water in a hand-hammered copper kettle. "Can I offer either of you tea? I have a lovely first flush Darjeeling." "No, no tea," Julian snapped quickly, desperately trying to regain his footing. He pulled out a chair and sat down, dropping the black leather folder onto the expensive walnut wood. He had to regain control of the narrative. So what if she took out massive, high-interest loans to renovate the house? She was probably drowning in debt, leveraging the property to the absolute hilt just to play pretend and look successful for her neighbors. That's it, he reasoned to himself. She is house poor. She is desperate for cash. Chloe sat next to him, running her hand nervously over the smooth wood of the table. She looked significantly less confident now. Her eyes kept darting between her Cartier bracelets and the museum-quality abstract painting hanging on the brick wall. Her manufactured glamour suddenly felt incredibly loud and cheap in the presence of true, quiet luxury. Eleanor walked over carrying a single, delicate bone china teacup for herself. She sat opposite Julian, crossing her legs gracefully. "So, the legal formality," Eleanor said, taking a slow sip. Julian opened the folder, pushing aside his unease. "As you may have read in the Wall Street Journal, Sterling Data Solutions has become incredibly successful. We are currently finalizing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition by Apex Global." "I am aware," Eleanor said, blowing softly on her tea. "A $2 billion valuation. Congratulations, Julian. You finally got your castle in the sky." "Yes." "Well," Julian cleared his throat, pulling a thick stack of stapled legal papers from the folder and sliding them across the table. "During the due diligence phase, Apex's lawyers flagged a tiny anomaly. When we divorced, you signed away your equity in the company. However, the foundational algorithm, the core predictive data sorting code, was technically authored by you before the company was officially incorporated." Eleanor took another slow sip of her tea. "The Aura algorithm." "Yes. I remember writing it on a remarkably slow laptop in a freezing apartment while you were out networking at bars." "Right," Julian said, gritting his perfectly bleached teeth. "The original divorce settlement transferred all intellectual property to the company. But Apex wants an ironclad, supplementary non-disclosure and quitclaim agreement, specifically naming the Aura algorithm, just to ensure there are no phantom claims to the underlying architecture. It is a standard housekeeping measure." Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek titanium pen, placing it on top of the document. Then, he reached back into the folder and pulled out a certified cashier's check. He slid the check across the table, placing it next to the pen. "I know things must be tight," Julian said, his false confidence returning as he tapped the paper check. "And despite how things ended, I am not a cruel man. I am offering you $50,000. Tax-free." Julian leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Just sign the document, Eleanor. Take the money. Pay off some of the massive debt you clearly took on to build this room, and we never have to see each other again." Chapter 3. The quitclaim. Eleanor did not look at the check. She didn't look at the titanium pen. She simply looked at Julian with an expression of mild, clinical fascination. And then, she slowly turned her gaze to Chloe. $50,000, Eleanor repeated, her tone completely unreadable. Chloe, eager to assert her dominance and prove her worth to Julian, snatched the check from the table. She held it out aggressively toward Eleanor, shaking the paper so it snapped loudly in the quiet room. "It is more than generous for a simple signature," Chloe sneered, trying to sound authoritative but ultimately sounding shrill. "Julian is doing you a massive favor. Just take the money, buy yourself some clothes with actual brand names on them, and stop trying to drag him down. This is more money than you could make cleaning this house for a decade." Eleanor's gray eyes locked onto Chloe's. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Eleanor slowly reached out and took the check from Chloe's manicured fingers. She didn't snatch it. She took it with effortless, terrifying grace. She placed it neatly on the table. "You always were a terrible liar, Julian," Eleanor said softly, turning her attention back to her ex-husband. Julian frowned, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his polished veneer. "Excuse me? You are looking at a certified check. There is no lie. You didn't come all the way to Brooklyn because of a tiny anomaly," Eleanor said, setting her delicate teacup back onto its saucer with a soft, decisive clink. "Apex Global didn't flag a ghost in the machine." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the beautiful walnut table. "Apex Global halted the merger negotiations 3 days ago because their tech auditors realized that Sterling Data Solutions doesn't actually own the Aura algorithm at all." Julian's face instantly drained of all color. The smug, predatory confidence vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. Chloe looked at him, completely confused by his sudden physical reaction. "Babe, what is she talking about?" What are you talking about?" Julian forced out, his voice suddenly sounding hollow and thin. "When we divorced, I signed away my equity in Sterling Data Solutions," Eleanor explained calmly, speaking as if she were lecturing a slow student. "I signed away my rights to the branding, the the client lists, and the physical corporate assets. But what your expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers failed to notice, because they didn't understand the underlying code, was that the Aura algorithm was never an asset of Sterling Data. The room was deathly quiet. Only the faint, ambient hum of the commercial refrigerator could be heard. It was a licensed utility, Eleanor whispered, her eyes locking onto his. A patented Aura under a separate holding company registered in Delaware 6 months before we even got married. Eleanor continued. Sterling Data has been using my code on a free, revocable, open-ended beta license for a decade. She paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. A license that, as of midnight last night, I officially revoked. Julian stared at her, the reality of her words hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. If Sterling Data didn't have the Aura algorithm, the company was essentially an empty shell. The software wouldn't function. The $2 billion valuation was built entirely on stolen air. And $50,000, Eleanor said, finally glancing down at the check with a look of profound, aristocratic amusement. Won't even cover the legal fees for the cease and desist order my attorneys served your board of directors 10 minutes ago. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He looked from Eleanor's perfectly calm face down to the $50,000 cashier's check resting on the table, and then to the stack of legal documents his expensive team at Sullivan and Cromwell had so desperately prepared. You're bluffing, Julian said, but his voice lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded desperate, pathetic. You can't patent code while employed by a company and claim it as your own. That violates every non-compete and IP assignment clause in corporate law. You are absolutely right, Julian, Eleanor said, taking another unhurried sip of her Darjeeling tea. If I had written the Aura architecture while employed by Sterling Data Solutions, it would be your property. But as I recall, and as the incorporation documents clearly show, Sterling Data wasn't legally formed until March of 2014. She set her teacup down again. I filed the patent for the Aura predictive sorting matrix in September of 2013, Eleanor continued, her voice echoing the terrifying precision of the code she wrote. I filed it under a limited liability company called Onyx Innovations. I was the sole proprietor. When you officially incorporated Sterling Data, I granted the company a beta use, non-exclusive, revocable license for the framework. It was buried in the initial vendor agreements. Eleanor smiled. It was a cold, surgical smile. You were so busy throwing launch parties in Palo Alto and trying to get your face on the cover of Forbes that you never actually read the foundational technical contracts. You just signed exactly where I told you to sign. Chloe, who had been aggressively silent, finally spoke up. Her eyes darted frantically between Julian's pale, sweating face and Eleanor's serene one. Babe, what is she talking about? Chloe demanded, her voice shrill. What does revoked mean? The merger with Apex is still happening, right? I already booked the venue in Aspen for our wedding in January. The deposit is non-refundable. Julian completely ignored her. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as he reached into the breast pocket of his Tom Ford suit and pulled out his iPhone. His thumb frantically swiped across the screen, dialing his general counsel, David Kensington. He put the phone on speaker, slamming it down onto the walnut table. It rang once, twice. Julian. David's voice barked through the speaker. He sounded completely exhausted, entirely stripped of his usual corporate bravado. Tell me you didn't go to Brooklyn. David, what the hell is happening? Julian demanded, leaning over the phone, desperate for a lifeline. I'm sitting here with Eleanor. She's spouting some absolute nonsense about Onyx Innovations and a revoked license. Tell me this is a minor snag. Tell me her patent doesn't hold up. A heavy, utterly defeated sigh crackled over the line. Julian, she's not spouting nonsense, David said grimly. We've been tearing the archives apart since the Apex due diligence team flagged the IP discrepancy on Friday. We found the original vendor agreement from 2014. Sterling Data doesn't own the underlying architecture of the Aura algorithm. We never did. Julian felt the room tilt violently. We had a license, David continued, sounding like a man reading his own obituary. And our servers just got hit with a digital cease and desist protocol at exactly midnight. We are legally barred from utilizing the core sorting matrix. Then override it. Julian screamed, spittle flying from his lips. Get the engineering team to patch the code. Bypass our authorization. We can't, Julian, David replied, his tone grave. Without the Aura Foundation, our entire cloud infrastructure collapses. It's the skeleton of our whole platform. If we write a patch, it will take 2 years of development. We don't have 2 years. There was a long, agonizing pause. Apex Global officially withdrew their acquisition offer an hour ago. Julian, David said. They notified the SEC. The news is going to hit the wire before the market closes today. Julian felt as though the floor had vanished beneath him. The $2 billion valuation, his net worth, his identity as a tech titan. His entire empire was vanishing into thin air, blowing away like dust. He had spent the last 5 years believing he was a visionary, an architect of the future who had outgrown the quiet, plain woman who had built his foundation. In reality, he had been living in a fragile glass house built entirely on stolen land, and Eleanor had just quietly thrown a boulder through the roof. Fix it, David. Julian choked out, tears of pure panic stinging his eyes. Throw money at it. Injunct her. Sue her for breach of contract. There's nothing to injunct, David said quietly. She owns it, Julian. It's her property. And we just lost our buyer. I have to go brief the board of directors. Do not say another word to her without representation. The line went dead. The silence returned to the living room, heavier and colder than before. Chapter 4. The Titan revealed. Chloe slowly pushed her chair back from the table. The defensive, haughty posture she had carried into the house had completely evaporated. Julian, she whispered, her voice trembling with raw fear. Does this mean are you broke? Shut up, Chloe, Julian snapped, burying his face in his trembling hands. Eleanor watched him. Her expression was entirely devoid of the vindictive, petty joy Julian would have expected. There was only a calm, clinical satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction a master architect feels when a building perfectly withstands a simulated earthquake. 5 years, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through a spiraling panic. 5 years ago, you sat across from me in a sterile mediation room in Midtown and told me I was dead weight. You told me my lack of vision was holding you back. You handed me the deed to this ruined shell of a house and a modest alimony check, and you thought you had cleanly excised me from your life. Julian slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot. The arrogant swagger of the billionaire CEO was entirely stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, hollow man. Why didn't you do this sooner? He asked, his voice cracking horribly. If you had the power to kill the company, why wait half a decade? Because 5 years ago, Sterling Data was only worth $50 million. Eleanor stated matter-of-factly. Destroying you then wouldn't have taught you anything. You would have just pivoted, raised more venture capital, and started another tech bro grift. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. I needed you to build it higher, Eleanor whispered. I needed you to get so close to an astronomical, multi-billion-dollar payday that you could actually taste it. I wanted you to feel the exact moment gravity took over. Julian stared at her, genuinely horrified by the sheer, calculating patience of her revenge. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't fought the divorce. She had simply retreated into the shadows, quietly polishing her weapon, waiting for the precise moment he was most vulnerable. I'll buy it, Julian suddenly blurted out, a desperate, manic energy seizing him. He grabbed the titanium pen and the $50,000 check, violently shoving them aside. I'll buy Onyx Innovations from you right now. Whatever Apex was going to pay me, I'll give you a massive cut. 50 million, 100 million. Just reinstate the license, Eleanor. Let the merger go through. We can both walk away rich. Eleanor laughed. It was a rich, warm, melodic sound that echoed off the high, glass-paneled ceilings. Oh, Julian, Eleanor said, wiping a small tear of genuine amusement from her eye. You still don't understand the board you're playing on. She stopped laughing. Her face hardened into an expression of absolute, terrifying power. You think Apex Global walked away from the merger because they don't want the technology anymore. Julian froze. What? Apex Global is a data logistics conglomerate, Eleanor explained, leaning forward, her gray eyes locking him in a dead stare. They don't care about your branding. They don't care about your sleek Silicon Valley office. They don't care about your bloated executive salaries. They only ever wanted the Aura algorithm. She reached into the pocket of her linen trousers. When their due diligence team discovered the IP anomaly, they didn't just walk away from you, Julian. Eleanor pulled out her own sleek, matte black smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times, bringing up an email, and slid it across the walnut table toward Julian. Chapter 5. The True Acquisition. Julian stared at the phone resting on the pristine walnut table. His hand was shaking so violently, he had to press them flat against his thighs to steady himself. He leaned forward, his eyes desperately trying to focus on the text illuminated on the screen. It was an email from Robert Hayes, the CEO of Apex Global. It was time-stamped just 2 hours ago. It was not addressed to Julian, nor was it addressed to Sterling Data Solutions. It was addressed to Eleanor Vance, CEO, Onyx Innovations LLC. Subject: Finalization of acquisition terms. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He read the body of the email. Eleanor, our board has officially approved the acquisition of the Onyx Holding Company and all associated intellectual property for the sum of $2.8 billion in cash and stock options. The wire transfer for the initial liquid payout will hit your private accounts at 9 a.m. tomorrow when the banks open. We look forward to having you join our executive board as Chief Technology Officer. Julian stared at the screen, the numbers blurring together as his stomach plummeted into an endless, terrifying void. $2.8 billion. They're not buying your company, Julian, Eleanor said softly, delivering the final, fatal blow with the precision of a sniper. They're buying mine. The silence in the room was no longer just heavy. It was a physical, suffocating force. It pressed against Julian's eardrums, a high-pitched, ringing vacuum that drowned out the faint trickle of the koi pond outside. He stared at the glowing digits in the email from the CEO of Apex Global. The numbers seemed to detach themselves from the screen, floating in the air, searing themselves into his retinas. It was a sum so vast, so staggeringly incomprehensible, that it completely short-circuited his brain's ability to process panic. For a terrifying, suspended moment, his mind simply went blank. The bespoke Tom Ford suit, tailored to absolute perfection just weeks ago to make him look like a conqueror, suddenly felt like a straitjacket lined with lead. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs, desperate to escape. He slowly looked up from the screen to Eleanor. She was sitting perfectly still, bathed in the soft, diffused afternoon light pouring through the massive structural glass skylight. She didn't look like an ex-wife anymore. She didn't look like a quiet, plain coder. She looked exactly like a queen sitting on a throne of reclaimed French oak and quiet, unassailable power. There was no gloating in her expression. There was no petty, vindictive joy. There was only the clinical, satisfied stillness of a master architect watching a perfectly designed demolition execute exactly according to plan. They went behind my back, Julian stammered. The voice that came out of his throat did not belong to the billionaire CEO of Sterling Data Solutions. It was thin, reedy, and fractured. The voice of a child trying to explain a shattered vase. Apex approached you without telling me. Business is business, Julian, Eleanor said, her rich alto voice echoing the exact, sterile phrase he had used against her 5 years ago in the divorce mediation. She picked up her delicate bone-china teacup and took a measured sip. When Apex's due diligence auditors pulled the floorboards up on Sterling Data, they realized they were about to buy an empty vessel carrying stolen, uninsured cargo. They did what any rational, billion-dollar conglomerate would do to protect their investment. Eleanor set the teacup down with a soft, deliberate clink that made Julian flinch. They bypassed the middleman, she continued, leaning forward slightly, her dark gray eyes locking onto his pale face. And they went straight to the cargo's owner. Chloe, who had been sitting frozen like a mannequin beside Julian, suddenly snapped back to life. Her perfectly manicured hands, weighed down by the heavy stack of Cartier love bracelets, gripped the edge of the live-edge walnut table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Wait," Chloe said, her voice shrill, tearing through the heavy atmosphere like a siren. She looked frantically between Julian's ghost-white face and Eleanor's serene one. "Wait, Julian, stop. What is she saying? Is she saying you don't own the company anymore? What about the IPO money? What about your shares? We are ringing the bell at the stock exchange next month. I already invited my friends. Julian couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at anything except his own hands, which were now resting uselessly on the table, shaking uncontrollably. The shares, Julian whispered, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. My God, the stock. When the SEC filing hits the wire, Eleanor finished for him, her tone completely devoid of malice, which somehow made the reality of it infinitely worse. When the market finds out you lost the core IP and the merger collapsed, your stock will be trading for pennies by the opening bell tomorrow. Your board of directors, Eleanor added, stating a factual, mathematical certainty, will have a fiduciary duty to the remaining shareholders to remove you as chief executive officer immediately for gross negligence. You failed to secure the foundational intellectual property of your own company before trying to take it public. That is corporate fraud, Julian. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. You will be locked out of the building by dinner time, Eleanor said quietly. Your corporate accounts will be frozen, and your personal assets will be heavily scrutinized before your Maybach even crosses the Brooklyn Bridge. Chloe stood up so fast her Hans Wegner wishbone chair scraped violently against the reclaimed wood floor. The harsh sound echoed up to the 20-foot ceiling. Are you bankrupt? Chloe demanded, her voice rising a full octave, cracking with hysteria. The carefully cultivated, soft-spoken, loving influencer persona was entirely gone, vaporized by raw, unfiltered panic. Julian, look at me. Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at him. Tell me she is lying. I just signed a final lease agreement on the St. Regis estate in Aspen for the wedding. The catering deposit was $100,000, and it is non-refundable. I booked the flights to Milan for my dress fitting on your American Express. She looked down at her wrists, shaking the heavy gold bracelets as if they had suddenly turned into iron shackles. Chloe, please, Julian begged, finally tearing his eyes away from the table to look up at her. His face was a mask of sheer terror. I can fix this. I know people. I can secure emergency private equity. I have favors I can call in. I can build something else. We just have to weather the storm. Build something else. Chloe shrieked, backing away from the magnificent dining table, as if Julian was suddenly radiating a deadly, highly contagious virus. Are you insane? She yelled, her face contorting with disgust. You're 46 years old, and you just lost $2 billion in 10 minutes because you didn't read a contract. I am 23 years old, Julian. I have brand deals. I have a following. I am not spending the best years of my life helping you rebuild in some cramped, rented apartment while you fight federal lawsuits and SEC investigations. Eleanor watched the performance with mild, academic interest. She rested her chin on her hand, observing the spectacular, dog-eat-dog implosion of Julian's carefully curated life. It was better than any prestige drama on television. It was entirely unscripted and thoroughly deserved. You're leaving, Julian gasped, standing up on shaky legs, reaching a desperate hand out toward his fiancée. Right now? After everything? You're just walking out. Everything. Chloe scoffed, her voice dripping with venom. She snatched her pristine white Chanel tweed jacket off the back of her chair and clutched her quilted leather purse defensively to her chest. Everything was the lifestyle, Julian, Chloe spat. You told me you were a titan of industry. You told me she was a nobody who couldn't keep up with your genius. Chloe pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at Eleanor, who remained completely unfazed. She has a custom koi pond in Brooklyn that costs more than my entire life. Chloe yelled at him. You're a fraud, Julian. You're a complete fake. Without waiting for a response, Chloe spun on her red-soled Louboutins and practically sprinted down the dimly lit, raw plaster hallway toward the front door. A moment later, the heavy 1890s wooden front door slammed shut with a concussive boom that rattled the door frame. Julian stood frozen at the table, staring down the empty corridor. In the span of less than half an hour, he had been systematically stripped of his multi-billion-dollar empire, his professional reputation, his staggering net worth, and his future wife. He slowly turned back to Eleanor. The arrogant swagger, the predatory confidence, the polished veneer of the Silicon Valley conqueror, it was all entirely gone. He looked broken, hollowed out, a mere shell of the man who had confidently knocked on her door earlier that afternoon. He fell back heavily into his chair, burying his face in his hands. A wretched, guttural sound escaped his throat. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate sob he couldn't suppress. "Eleanor, please. I am begging you. You've made your point. You've humiliated me in front of Chloe. You destroyed my company. I understand I was wrong." He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "But please don't take absolutely everything. Give me a licensing deal, a fraction of a percent, anything to pacify the board. If I walk out of here with nothing, they will personally sue me into oblivion. I'll lose the Manhattan penthouse. I'll lose my personal accounts. I will be ruined." Chapter 6. The final verdict. Eleanor looked at the weeping man across from her. She actively searched her heart for a single, microscopic shred of pity, a lingering ghost of the profound affection she had once held for the ambitious, bright-eyed graduate student she had married a decade ago. But there was absolutely nothing there. The well was completely dry. There was only the cold, clean, mathematical architecture of justice. 5 years ago, Julian, Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying a quiet, devastating finality that cut right through his sobbing, "I sat across from you in a sterile mediation room in Midtown. I didn't ask you for half of the company I helped you build. I didn't ask to bleed you dry. I asked for a fair share, just enough to start over comfortably and securely." She paused, letting the memory fill the space between them. "And you looked me dead in the eye," Eleanor continued, "with your 3 aggressive corporate lawyers flanked behind you like bodyguards. And you laughed." Julian squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to physically dislodge the memory. "You told me that my lack of vision was a liability," Eleanor said, her voice remaining perfectly steady. "You told me that business is a zero-sum game. You said, to the victor go the spoils, Eleanor, and the weak get exactly what they deserve." Eleanor stood up from the beautiful walnut table. She stood tall, radiant, and utterly unbothered by the wreckage of the man at her feet. "You set the rules of this game, Julian," Eleanor said, looking down at him with eyes as hard as obsidian. "I didn't cheat. I just played your game infinitely better than you did." She gestured toward the front hallway. "Now, I highly suggest you take your $50,000 check and leave my home. My contractors are arriving at 8 a.m. tomorrow to install the climate controls for the new wine cellar, and I genuinely do not want your negative energy lingering in the foundation of my house." Julian did not say another word. He couldn't. His throat felt as though it had been packed with dry sand. The silence in Eleanor's immaculate, sun-drenched living room pressed against his eardrums, heavier than the crushing gravity of the billions he had just lost. He looked down at the walnut dining table. Sitting next to the useless, unsigned stack of legal documents was the certified cashier's check for $50,000. Only an hour ago, he had pulled it from his bespoke jacket pocket, feeling like a benevolent god tossing a coin to a beggar. Now, looking at the crisp paper and the neatly printed zeros, a nauseating wave of realization washed over him. That piece of paper, drawn from his personal discretionary account rather than corporate funds, was likely the only liquid asset he would have left by the end of the week. With fingers that trembled violently, Julian slowly reached out. He picked up the check. He didn't look at Eleanor as he folded it in half, then into quarters, and slid into the breast pocket of his Tom Ford suit. It felt entirely weightless, yet it dragged his posture down like a lead weight. He turned away from the table, his legs moving with the stiff, shuffling gait of a man who had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. The walk down the dimly lit, raw plaster hallway felt agonizingly long. When he had first walked down this corridor, he had viewed the exposed brick and dust as evidence of Eleanor's pathetic, stagnant life. Now he understood the truth. It was the entryway to a fortress. He was the one who had been living in a fragile glass house, and she had just thrown a boulder through the roof. Julian reached the heavy wooden front door. He grasped the antique brass handle, pulled it open, and stepped out onto the Brooklyn stoop. The crisp, late October air hit his face, smelling of exhaust, roasted nuts, and impending rain. The world outside had not stopped. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A group of teenagers laughed loudly on the opposite corner, and the bodega neon sign buzzed aggressively. Everything was exactly as it had been. Yet Julian's entire universe had just been fundamentally erased. He looked toward the curb, expecting to see the sleek, obsidian black silhouette of his 2025 Mercedes Maybach waiting to whisk him away from this nightmare. He needed the climate-controlled cabin. He needed the tinted windows to hide his face. The curb was empty. Julian blinked, stepping down the peeling concrete stairs. "Thomas," he croaked, looking frantically up and down the street. There was an old Toyota Camry parked exactly where his $500,000 car had been idling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was already lit up like a Christmas tree, vibrating continuously with an unyielding stream of notifications. He ignored the missed calls and immediately opened his text messages, searching for his driver. There was a message from Thomas, sent 5 minutes ago. "Mr. Vance, Miss Thorne informed me of the situation regarding the company's sudden insolvency. She instructed me to drive her immediately to JFK Airport. She mentioned a non-refundable first-class ticket to Milan she booked on Your American Express. Furthermore, considering the news breaking on Bloomberg regarding the SEC investigation into Sterling Data Solutions, I am formally submitting my resignation effective immediately. I will leave the Maybach keys with the valet at the airport. Best of luck." Julian stared at the glowing text, his breathing becoming incredibly shallow and erratic. Chloe had not just left him. She had commandeered his vehicle and was actively fleeing the country on his dime before his credit lines could be frozen. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his state of shock. He needed to get out of Bedford-Stuyvesant. He needed to get to his penthouse in Manhattan before the board of directors changed the locks. He opened his Uber app, his thumb shaking so badly he could barely tap the screen. He selected an Uber black SUV, typed in his Tribeca address, and hit confirm. A red banner flashed across the top of his screen. "Payment method declined. Please update your billing information." No. Julian muttered, tapping the screen frantically. He tried his corporate platinum card. Declined. He tried his personal black card. Declined. The corporate freeze had already begun. The board of directors wasn't just firing him. They were severing every financial artery he possessed. As he stood stranded on the cracked pavement, his phone began to vibrate with a new, terrifying intensity. The digital avalanche had arrived. Julian watched, paralyzed, as the push notifications cascaded down his lock screen in real time. Wall Street Journal. Breaking. Apex Global withdraws $4.2 billion acquisition of Sterling Data Solutions, citing massive IP fraud. Bloomberg Markets. Trading halted on NASDAQ for STDS, pending SEC emergency inquiry. Stock plummets 82% in pre-market/after-hours trading. Text message. David Kensington, General Counsel Julian. Do not return to the office. Do not speak to the press. The board has retained independent litigation counsel. You are personally liable for the IP misrepresentation. I am so sorry, but I have to recuse myself. Finally, an email notification popped up. It was from Arthur Pendleton, the ruthless 70-year-old chairman of the board for Sterling Data Solutions. The subject line was capitalized and entirely devoid of any corporate politeness. Immediate termination for cause and notice of pending litigation. Julian didn't even need to open the email to know what it said. They were stripping him of his title, his remaining equity, and his golden parachute. They were going to feed him to the federal regulators to save themselves. His fingers went numb. The sleek, titanium-backed iPhone slipped from his grasp. It hit the concrete sidewalk with a sharp crack, the expensive screen shattering into a dense spiderweb of fractured glass. The screen flickered, showing one last notification from a news outlet before going completely dark. Julian Vance, the man who had woken up that morning as a titan of Silicon Valley, did not bend down to pick it up. He simply turned his collar up against the biting autumn wind, shoved his hands into his empty pockets, and began to walk aimlessly down the Brooklyn street, swallowed by the shadows of the very neighborhood he had come to mock. Back inside the brownstone, the heavy wooden door had shut with a solid, satisfying thud. Eleanor stood in the dimly lit entryway for a moment, listening to the absolute silence of her home. The intrusive, frantic energy Julian and Chloe had brought into her sanctuary had been entirely expunged. The air felt lighter, cleaner. She walked slowly back into the massive, sun-drenched living room. The afternoon light pouring through the structural glass skylight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into tiny floating diamonds. She moved toward the stunning walnut dining table, her eyes falling on the single bone china teacup she had been drinking from, and the empty space where Julian's desperate $50,000 check had laid. Eleanor picked up the teacup and carried it into her pristine, matte black kitchen. She poured the remaining cold Darjeeling tea down the polished marble sink, watching the dark amber liquid swirl and vanish down the drain. It was a simple, mundane action, but it felt profoundly ceremonial. 5 years of waiting, of quiet planning, of enduring the condescension of a man who had stolen her brilliance, had just been washed away. She walked over to the massive retractable glass doors at the back of the room and slid them open. The cool breeze swept in, rustling the leaves of the bamboo stalks in her private courtyard. She stepped out onto the reclaimed wood deck, walking over to the edge of the Japanese koi pond. She watched the massive, vibrant orange and white fish glide silently beneath the surface of the dark water. They moved with absolute purpose, never rushing, never thrashing. They simply navigated their environment with ancient, unbothered grace. Eleanor had spent hours sitting by this pond over the last 5 years, using its tranquility to center her mind while she meticulously crafted the legal and digital traps that had just sprung flawlessly. Her phone, resting on the kitchen island, chimed with a soft, melodic tone. Eleanor turned, walking back inside. She picked up the sleek, matte black device and looked at the screen. It was a secure text message from Robert Hayes, the CEO of Apex Global. Eleanor, the final contracts have been fully executed by our legal team and filed with the regulatory boards. The wire transfer for the initial $1.4 billion liquid payout will hit your private accounts at 9 a.m. tomorrow when the banks open. The remaining stock options will vest according to the schedule we agreed upon. A second message immediately followed. I also saw the news breaking about Sterling Data. It is a bloodbath over there. You played a masterful game of chess. I am incredibly honored to have you joining our executive board as Chief Technology Officer. See you at dinner next Tuesday in Manhattan. Eleanor read the messages twice. The numbers, $1.4 billion in liquid cash, were astronomical, but they didn't induce the frantic, breathless panic that had consumed Julian. To Eleanor, the money was merely a metric of her code's value. It was undeniable, mathematical proof that her mind was the true architect of the empire. She typed a brief, elegant reply. Thank you, Robert. The code is secure, and the transition will be seamless. Looking forward to Tuesday. She locked her phone and set it down. Next to the gleaming La Marzocco espresso machine, she reached for a fresh portafilter, ground a dose of dark roast Ethiopian beans, and began to steam milk for a latte. The hiss of the steam wand filled the quiet kitchen, a warm, comforting sound. Eleanor looked around her magnificent, multi-million-dollar fortress. She had built this life brick by brick, line of code by line of code, in the absolute silence of her own genius. Julian had come to burn it down, completely unaware that he was standing on a floor coated in gasoline, holding the very match that would immolate his own life. She poured the steamed milk over the rich, dark espresso, creating a perfect, symmetrical Rosetta pattern in the foam. Taking the ceramic mug in her hands, she let the heat warm her palms. She took a sip, closed her eyes, and smiled. The ghost in the machine had finally been laid to rest, and for the first time in a decade, the architecture of her life belonged entirely to her. If this story lit a fire in you, if you understand the quiet, immovable power of a woman who turns her silence into a weapon, hit the subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because the stories worth hearing are about the invisible women who refuse to stay down when the world pushes them to the floor. See you in the next one.